Welcome to everyone, and thanks for taking the time to attend this presentation today. My name is Roland Angle, and I've been a registered civil engineer in California for the past 50 years. Presently, I'm a member of the Board of Directors for Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and we are advocating for a new investigation into the collapse of the 3 high-rise buildings at the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. The issue of the failure of these 3 buildings was a political event from the outset. Because it was a shocking crime of mass murder that caused us to question our national security, accusations and counter-accusations surrounding the circumstances of the event arose immediately and continue to this day. The engineering profession was thrust into the middle of this controversy because we're the experts in the design and construction of commercial structures and bear the responsibility for the safety of the people using them. Project Due Diligence, which Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth is publicly launching today, is our effort to strip away the political aspects of this world-changing event and look at the scientific facts gleaned from the evidence. Our aim is to determine one thing and one thing only. Did the buildings fail for the reasons given to us by the official reports? We will focus only on that question. The information you will hear today has been collected by literally thousands of persons, both inside and outside the field of engineering, who have donated their time, money, and expertise in order to determine the truth of what happened at the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. So many people have contributed to this effort that it would be impossible to name all of them. But please realize that the distillation of evidence you will see today is the result of hundreds of thousands of hours of work performed mostly by volunteers and guided by the AE 9/11 Truth staff. We will focus our analysis on 3 government reports on the World Trade Center building failures. The first is the work of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. The second and third are the work of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, a branch of the U.S. Department of Commerce. In addition, because the NIST report on the Twin Towers relied on a progressive collapse theory published by the American Society of Civil Engineers, we will analyze the ASCE theory as well. As you can see from the timeline of events we have provided to you, FEMA issued their preliminary report on the 3 building failures in 2002. Using FEMA's report as a foundation, NIST conducted its own investigations and issued a report on the collapse of the Twin Towers in September 2005, followed by another report on the collapse of Building 7 released in November of 2008. In addition, the ASCE published the theoretical analysis that is still accepted as the scientific basis for why the Twin Towers collapsed. As you will see at the conclusion of this presentation, we are urging the ASCE, as well as all civil and structural engineering organizations, to join us in calling for a new investigation into the failure of all 3 buildings. We base our decision to take this action on what we believe are critical errors in the NIST reports and the ASCE progressive collapse theory, errors which invalidate the NIST conclusions and the ASCE theoretical foundation. Have the 3 World Trade Center building failures on September 11, 2001 been adequately explained, or is it time for another look? There have been 6 reports on the building failures. The 3 that I just mentioned, FEMA in 2002, NIST, the Twin Towers in September 2005, and NIST again on World Trade Center 7, November 8th, in November 2008. Then there have been 3 privately funded reports that just looked into Building 7. The first 2, the Arup Group and the Weidlinger Associates, were done for the plaintiffs and the defendants in a lawsuit that was brought by Edison, Con Edison, and their insurance company against World Trade Center properties. Those were privately funded reports. In addition to that, there's the study that we funded, which again looks at World Trade Center 7. There was a preliminary report in last year in September that was done by the University of Alaska Fairbanks Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering under Professor Leroy Halsey. So those are the sum totals of the reports on the building failures that have been done to date. We're going to look at Building 7 first. It was the third high-rise to collapse that day. It collapsed in the afternoon, about 5:20. It was some distance away from the North Tower. 47-story building. Each floor had an area of about an acre. Shaped like a trapezoid. Gross floor area about 2 million square feet. And it was built through and over the existing 2-story tall Con Edison substation, which you can see here. This is the floor plan of everything above the Con Edison station. The upper right-hand corner of that floor plan is the northeast corner of the building, and that is the area where we're going to focus on, because it is that area where NIST says the collapse began. You can see that there are 58 columns on the perimeter, 24 central columns in the middle. We're going to stand right here and look west so that we can see the structural members that are of concern here. This is that view. This girder right here is the girder that NIST says walked off of its column support at column 79, which is in the interior of the building. It was pushed by these beams, which frame into it. Those beams were heated by the fire. They expanded and sagged, and they caused that girder to walk off its seat, and that led to a cascade of floors down below, which initiated the collapse. So we're going to pay a lot of attention to the facts surrounding those beams, that girder, and the column. This is a diagram of the foundation caissons showing that they went right through the Con Edison substation below. It looked like this during construction. And when it failed, about 7 hours after the Twin Towers went down, this 47-story steel frame building, which was not hit by a plane, collapsed and turned into this 5-story rubble pile in about 7 seconds. We'll see what it looks like here.
For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
We heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. It looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. About a second later, the bottom floor caved out. The building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
And I turned in time to see what looked like a skyscraper implosion. It looked like it had been done by a demolition crew. The whole thing just collapsing down on itself.
It was almost as if it were a planned implosion. It just pancaked.
That building was 350 feet away from the North Tower, and a small amount of debris from the tower hit the North Tower when it collapsed, hit the World Trade Center when it collapsed. FEMA mapped the debris, and you can see that the light debris from World Trade Center 1 reached the southern face of the building. Before and after pictures. Between the time that the North Tower collapsed and World Trade Center went down about 7 hours later, World Trade Center was on fire. You see the fire engulfing the smoke coming out of the south wall. Here's some pictures of the damage to the west wall between the 14th and the 26th floors. This is a look at the penthouse, which was on the roof, contained heavy equipment. FEMA mapped the damage, and they indicated that the debris hit the lower part of the building in the southwest corner and hit in the upper part of the building near the top. There was diesel fuel in the building. FEMA says that the diesel fires had a low probability of occurrence, and NIST agreed. Most of the fuel was recovered from the main tanks in a vault below ground level, and firefighters testified they neither saw nor heard nor smelled diesel fuel fires. In the early stages, people thought, well, maybe it was the diesel that had caused the collapse and the fires from that were affected, but NIST said no. There were fires on the 7th, 8th, 9th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 19th, 22nd, 29th, and the 30th floors. The fires on the upper 4 floors were out by 1:30. Now we'll look at their collapse theory. NIST says that thermal expansion of these beams pushed or pulled this girder off of its seat at this column, column 79. And that occurred on the 13th floor. That caused that girder to fall off its seat and impact the next floor down, which caused a cascade of floors all the way down to the 5th floor. That, in turn, left column 79 unsupported laterally for 9 floors, and it buckled as a result, and that buckling spread from north to south and from east to west through the central core columns, and they in turn collapsed, pulling down the columns on the outside, initiating global collapse. So that's their theory. We're going to look at the mechanism of that theory. According to NIST, the reason for the collapse was totally due to office fires. Now, office fires burn out an area in about 20 to 30 minutes because they run out of combustibles. This photo, which was taken 90 minutes before the collapse, shows the north face of the building, and we can see that there were fires on the 8th floor. There had been fires on the 7th floor. You can see the broken windows. There were some fires on the 12th floor at this point that apparently had burned from the northeast to the northwest corner of the building. They're over here in the area of column 52. And there was still some fire on the 13th floor at about columns 44 and 45. Here are the erroneous assumptions and omissions and the issues that we have with the report on Building 7. They said that the girder bearing seat at column 79 was only 11 inches wide, but it was actually 12 inches wide. They said that there were no stiffeners on the girder at the column. They claimed that the thermally expanded girder could move past the side plate on column 79. They said there were no shear studs on the girders. They said that the west and south girder connections into column 79 were broken all the way down to the 6th floor. They said that the northeast corner floor failure cascaded down 8 floors, and that there was no lateral support beams framing into beam G3005, that the beams and girders were notched to simulate their buckling due to fire in the model. That's in the NIST model. That there were evidence of temperatures high enough to melt steel, documented by FEMA, that NIST ignored, and that their model shows radical deformation of the upper exterior as the east side interior collapses, but that's not observed in the actual video footage of the collapse. And they claim that a simultaneous free fall of all 4 corners of the roofline has no implications. Then they refuse to respond to legitimate inquiry. And lastly, we'll summarize the problems with their report. So we're going to look at those issues one at a time. First of all, the seat on the column that supported the girder. You can see the seat right here. It's supported by a plate which was welded to the column at the flanges. And they said that the girder lost its vertical support when the web of the girder was no longer supported by the bearing seat. So in other words, the girder, which sat here, once it was pushed past, the web was pushed past the edge of the seat, it had lost support and it would fall. So they said that needed to happen after 5.5 inches, half of 11 inches. But the construction drawings, the Frankel drawing, showed, 1091, showed that the girder bearing seat was actually 12 inches wide. NIST later admitted that, and they issued an erratum, which was, I think, the only thing that they admitted to. We're going to take a minute and look at the temperatures that the structural members were exposed to. The NIST report claimed that the beams were heated to 600 degrees, the girder to 500 degrees centigrade, and the columns to 300 degrees centigrade in the area around column 79. So looking at the effect of those temperatures on the various members, this is the graph of the temperature versus the strength. This is a graph of the temperature versus the stiffness. Both those things would be affected by temperature. So we'll take a look at those one at a time. For the beams at 600 degrees centigrade, they would lose about half of their strength at that temperature. And they would lose about 70% of their stiffness. For the girders heated to 500 degrees, they would lose approximately 20% of their strength and approximately 40% of their stiffness. And the columns at 300 degrees wouldn't lose any of their strength and would lose about 20% of their stiffness. So those are kind of some parameters. We accepted those temperatures and we calculated accordingly. Looking at the beams at 600 degrees, we see at that temperature it expands a little over 5.5 inches, but it also sags about 1/8 of an inch for a net horizontal expansion of about 5.39 inches. That's what the statistics would indicate, where coefficient of expansion, and it's due to heat and it's sagging and loss of strength. The maximum that that beam could ever expand is right here at 654 degrees, because at that point the horizontal expansion is about 6.17 inches, it's sagging about 0.44 inches for a net expansion of 5.7. It could never expand any more than that, because after that the sagging takes over and it gets shorter again. So those beams could never push that girder more than 5.7 inches. So when the seat is 12 inches wide instead of 11 inches wide, the web of the girder can't get past the edge of the seat, and the girder can't fall off of the seat. So that's one of the problems that the NIST report has. Looking at that girder connection to the column, this is the NIST depiction here. You see the girder. It's sitting on its seat, supported by its plate. The problem with this depiction is that in reality there were a couple of stiffener plates that were welded to the girder, both at the web and at the lower flange, and those stiffeners would significantly strengthen this flange here, so that if the girder were able to move past the edge of the seat, this stiffener plate would make this flange so stiff that it wouldn't curl up and the girder wouldn't fail and fall off. NIST left those stiffener plates off of their analysis. Here's what it would look like in 3D. And the NIST analysis shows that the stiffeners weren't there. You have the beam coming in, the girder. This is the column. Looking at it from the column standpoint, you see there's no stiffeners here. Photo shows that the stiffener plates were in fact there. We're now going to turn for a moment to the study that was done at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and look at their finite element modeling of that particular portion of the building. This is their finite element model. It's in Abacus, and this is the 12th and 13th floor. Again, we're looking at this area here is what we're interested in, the northeast corner. For the University of Alaska study, they took the worst case temperatures, and this is their finite element model of that portion of the floor. It's the northeast corner, column 79 here. And their analysis showed that with the stiffener plates attached to the beam, right here, even when the web of the girder has moved past the corner of the seat, this stiffener plate stiffens this flange to the point where it's not going to curl up and give up and allow the girder to fall. NIST finally admitted leaving the stiffeners out. In this letter, they said that the web stiffeners were added at the end of the girder to prevent web crippling. And the structural analysis of World Trade Center did not show any web crippling. Therefore, the web crippling plates did not need to be included in their model analysis. So that is a rather startling statement, and we see that it was made by somebody in their public affairs office, and I'm sure he didn't realize the significance of what he was saying, because no engineer would make that statement. Then there's the issue of side plates on the column. The side plates were welded to the column, and they protruded 1.8 inches past the column flange. This occurred at every floor. So the UAF study shows that when you heat the beam, it pushes on the girder, you heat the girder expands, and it gets trapped behind those side plates, so that it's no way it can be pushed off of the seat. So NIST just left those side plates off or didn't include them in their analysis. They didn't consider that question at all, the fact that that girder could never get out past those side plates. Then there's the question of shear studs on the girders. NIST said that girder, 45 feet long, had no shear studs on it. But the final version of the revised drawings showed that there were 30 shear studs on that girder. Why is that important? Well, NIST does an analysis here of shear studs, and they show that the force required to shear this stud off is about 19.5 kips. So if you take that 19.5 kips times each of the 30 shear studs that there are, that would be a total of 585 kips that would have to be applied by the 5 beams from the east, pushing on the girder in order to break those shear studs. That's 117 kips for each of the 5 girders. But if you put an axial force of 21 kips on those beams, they begin to buckle, and they can't push any harder than that. And when you increase that temperature to 600 degrees, which is what the beams are supposed to be at, then that force is reduced to about 7 kips. So there's no way that a 7 kip force exerted by those beams is going to create 585 kips that are necessary to break those shear studs. NIST then claimed that the cascading floors, the girder at floor 13 fell down, hit the 12th floor, creating a cascade all the way down to the 5th floor. That left this column unsupported with no lateral support, and that's why it buckled. But there's a problem with that, because their own damage connection information shows that this is not true. They show that there was no damage to the girders from the south and the west at floors 8, 9, and 13. We can show that here. This is off of their report. The yellow dots at the girder coming in from the south and coming in from the west, this is for the vertical and for the horizontal direction, shows that those connections were intact on the 8th floor. They were also intact on the 9th floor. They were also intact on the 13th floor. So if that's true, column 79 wasn't unsupported all the way down. And this scenario that they point out is impossible, because the moment of inertia of that column shows that it could span at least 5 stories with no lateral support without buckling. So according to their own diagram, it was never unsupported for more than 3 continuous stories. So their own scenario, their own data shows that their own analysis is not possible. That's called an internal contradiction in their report. Furthermore, even if we allow the girder to fall, we'll forget all the things that have happened earlier here, we'll just allow the girder to fall, and that section of the floor is going to fall down. It's going to hit the floor near the column on the 12th floor. Now, the force that's required to shear the wells at that column of the 14-inch deep support plate under the girder is about 632,000 pounds. So that's the force that we have to have there hitting the floor before we can begin the cascade process. So we did a modal analysis of that section of the floor. Here it is, the 5 beams, the girder, and you can figure the frequency of this system, and it turns out to be about 0.52 hertz. And you can use that to find the stiffness of this section, and it turns out to be about 6,600 pounds per inch. Taking that stiffness and combining it with the stiffness of the floor below, which is very high, it's about over 7.5 million pounds per inch, combining them, you still get about the same, because you use a reciprocal formula here to figure that out. So the large stiffness of the floor below doesn't affect this number very much at all. So then you have a stiffness for the total system, the floor above and the floor below, and you can figure the deflection using this formula, and that turns out to be about 32 inches. So when the upper girder hits the lower floor, it deflects about 32 inches. Using that, you can find the force, and it turns out to be about 215,000 pounds. Well, that's only about a third of the 632,000 pounds that you need. And furthermore, when you heat it to 500 degrees, which is what they said that the girder was heated to, the stiffness gets less, and the force that it imparts to the lower floor also gets less. So you're only getting about 166,000 pounds, and you need 4 times that much in order to break that shear. So that shows that the cascade effect could never occur. Then we're going to look at the northernmost beam here. This is what they term beam G3005, and in reality that beam had 3 lateral supports coming into it from the north face of the building. The NIST analysis removed those, didn't show them at all. Now, that turns out to be important, because if you heat that beam to 600 degrees and there's no lateral support beams there, that beam's going to buckle. And that was confirmed by the UAF study. It said yes, without those beams there, that beam will buckle. However, when you put the beams in to check it, you see that it doesn't buckle. Then there's the issue of what they did to the floor beams and the girders. Here we see a picture from their report that shows the floor beams and the girders. This is the southwest corner of the building, and they have notched the beams and the girders in a very systematic fashion. You see they always notch 1/2 on one end on the upper side and on the lower side on the other side. They do that consistently throughout. Well, they do that because they have to get their global collapse theory to work. In other words, once they've got the interior columns to go down, they need to pull down the exterior columns, so they notch the beams to make it happen. But there's no justification, because the only thing you got working on those beams is fires. And fires are not going to create that kind of symmetrical damage to the beams and the girders. So that is a totally unjustified assumption. They just do it to make their system work. Then there's the issue of high temperatures. This is the only piece of metal that was salvaged from World Trade Center 7. NIST ignored this piece of evidence. When that metal was examined by FEMA, they said they had microstructural changes, severe erosion, severe high temperature corrosion attack on the steel, including oxidation and sulfidation, with intergranular melting, readily visible, a liquid eutectic mixture containing primarily iron, oxygen, and sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. And the eutectic temperature for this mixture strongly suggests that the temperature in this region of the steel beam approached 1,000 degrees centigrade, which is substantially lower than that would be expected for melting the steel. So how can you get steel to melt at 1,000 degrees? Well, you add things like sulfur. If you took, for instance, thermite and added sulfur to it, you get thermate. That lowers the melting point of steel. That would be what you would do with an incendiary. Again, NIST completely ignored this piece of evidence. The USGS flew over the site 5 days after it occurred, and they took this infrared photograph, which shows the hot spots in the area of both the towers and Building 7. Those temperatures were somewhere around between 600 and 750 degrees centigrade. And there were additional reports by many eyewitnesses of molten metal in the basement of all three buildings. But the official report by NIST and FEMA and the 9/11 Commission omit any mention of the large quantities of molten metal observed in the basement areas. We're going to look at the comparison of the actual collapse on your left with the NIST model on your right. And we're going to compare how they appear, whether they're similar or whether they're different. You can see down here in this area, that's the northeast corner of the building. The 13th floor collapses first, column 79 becomes unsupported, and so on. But you see what begins to happen to their model. And in fact, they stopped their model after a few seconds into the recording. So compare what you're seeing on your right with what you're seeing on the left. This is a diagram of what that collapse of their model would look like a few more seconds into the sequence. And you see why they stopped the sequence, because the top of the building has twisted completely around, and the building doesn't look anything like what it looked like when it actually collapsed. This particular model is their model without debris damage to the building. They didn't even show the one with debris damage, so it must have been just as bad or worse. Next, we look at the question of free fall acceleration. A physics teacher, David Chandler, analyzing the video, proved that the entire roof line of the building was in full free fall acceleration for about 2.5 seconds, which would be about an 8-story fall. That occurred near the beginning of its collapse. NIST was confronted with this fact during their draft report, and they admitted it in their final report, but they didn't address the implications of free fall, and they didn't change their model or their conclusion. Here we've got a graph of the velocity of the top of the building versus time, and we see at about 3/4 of a second into the collapse, it went into free fall. The slope of this line is free fall acceleration. And that occurred from about 3/4 of a second to well over 3 seconds. That's important because columns provide resistance during buckling. Once you initiate buckling in a column, the force required to continue buckling that column decays until the ratio of the deflection to the length reaches about 0.5. At that point, a still significant minimum resistance is reached, so the free fall acceleration is not possible during buckling. You still got a ratio that is something about a third. Now in free fall, all of an object's potential energy is converted to kinetic energy. It can't be doing any other work. So the free falling upper section, C, could not have been crushing the lower portions B and A or itself. It appears that section B is not providing any resistance at all. Since the NIST model never accelerates at more than 60% of free fall, it cannot explain this free fall episode in the collapse. So all the assumptions below, which were used in their model and in their report, have been shown to be erroneous, and the correction of these assumptions invalidate their conclusion. The girder bearing seat was 12 inches, not 11 inches. The omitted stiffeners would have prevented the flange from folding and eliminated any chance of a girder walk-off. The thermally expanded girder could not move past the side plate on the column. There were shear studs on the girder, and this would cause the beams to buckle before pushing the girder off of its seat. All west and south girder connections were not broken down to the 6th floor. Northeast corner floor failure could not cascade down 8 floors. There's not enough energy to break through the girder connection on the next floor down. There were lateral support beams framing into beam G3005, and they would have prevented it from buckling. The beam and girder notching that NIST used to simulate their buckling due to fire in the model is not consistent with time-phased weakening that fire would produce. That evidence of temperatures high enough to melt steel documented by FEMA was ignored. Their model shows radical deformation of the upper exterior as the east side interior collapses, but this is not observed in the actual video footage of the collapse. And a simultaneous free fall of all 4 corners of the roof line does have implications. NIST refused to respond to legitimate inquiry. When asked by engineers to provide calculations and analysis results substantiating the girder walk-off at column 79 and the impact force required to break through the next floor down, the NIST director refused, claiming that it might jeopardize public safety. So here's the letter that Ron Bookman, who happens to be here, wrote, and their response. And another letter that was written later by another engineer, same response, might jeopardize public safety. So they've taken the position that a discussion of the laws of physics might jeopardize public safety, which has got to be a first in history. So we're looking at the problems with their report. They initially claimed that the girder seat was 11 inches wide. It wasn't. It was 12 inches wide. They left off the stiffener plates and later said it didn't matter. They ignored the side plates on column 79. They omitted the shear studs on the girder. They claimed column 79 was laterally unsupported for 9 stories, but their own data showed it wasn't. They omitted the lateral support beams into beam G3005 that would have prevented it from buckling. They miscalculated the magnitude of the load imposed on the girder on the 12th floor caused by the collapse of the same girder above it on the 13th floor. When you calculate that accurately, the load isn't sufficient to break the girder connection to the column and could not initiate the progressive collapse that they claim followed it. They imposed unrealistic artificial fire damage symmetrically to the floor beams in order for their computer finite element model collapse sequence to work. They omitted the information contained in Appendix C of the FEMA report showing that the steel had evidence of intergranular melting. Their computer model doesn't replicate the actual collapse because it deforms significantly more than what's observed, and they stopped their simulation after about 2 seconds. They acknowledged that the building fell free fall for 2¼ seconds, but that violates their fire-induced theory of collapse initiation because asymmetrical fire damage couldn't result in symmetrical simultaneous loss of all 82 columns, and they refused to release relevant input data for critical calculations of their collapse models, saying that this information could jeopardize public safety. All right, now we're going to look at the Twin Towers. We're going to look at we'll give it a little background into the construction and design of the buildings, look at the aircraft impacts, the NIST column failure theory and their collapse hypothesis, the evidence that the core columns failed first. We'll look at the ASCE published progressive collapse theory and analyze that theory. We'll look at the South Tower collapse and the symmetry anomaly. We'll look at other high-rise fires, the destruction of the evidence. We'll summarize the problems with their tower report, and we'll categorize the deficiencies in their report and in the ASCE published theories. The Twin Towers were a departure from the high-rise tradition. Most high-rises were built with continuous grid of steel, columns, beams, girders. The Twin Towers were built as a tube structure with a dense mesh of welded and bolted steel placed on the perimeter. And that gives you more efficient lateral load resistance, and then it has an internal core of large welded steel columns connected by bolted horizontal beams at every floor, and the core and the perimeter columns split the gravity loads. So half's carried on the outside, half's carried with the core. Then you have prefabricated floor assemblies welded and bolted to the beams at the core and at the perimeter, and they are made up of double 29-inch deep trusses every 80 inches with 24-inch deep bridging trusses running normal to them every 13 feet. And they're topped with 1.5 inch deep corrugated steel floor pans and 4 inches of steel reinforced concrete. This allows for a much more efficient use. You can build the building lighter and stronger. And these structural innovations allowed for an open floor plan. The perimeter of the building was a 207-foot square. The core in the middle is 135 feet by 87 feet, and the largest floor span allowed then is 60 feet. They were very solidly constructed, had 47 massive steel core columns, 240 steel perimeter columns. That amounts to a steel frame that was a 100,000-ton heat sink. The central core columns were tapered as they rose up into the building, so they were virtual structural pyramids at the lower floors. They were heavy as they rose up into the towers. They eventually transitioned to rolled wide flange sections so that the very solid at the bottom got lighter as it went up at the top because, of course, it had less weight to carry. There were 12 different strength steels used at the different heights on the perimeter columns. That's to accommodate the wind load and the seismic stresses, keeping the gravity-induced unit stress on both the perimeter and the core columns at each floor the same. That's to eliminate floor warpage. The planes hit the building on 9/11. The North Tower was hit first at 8:46. It collapsed 102 minutes later. That was American Airlines Flight 11. It was a Boeing 767-200 extended range, and the estimated velocity was 473 miles per hour. It hit in the dead center of the north wall between the 93rd and the 99th floor. The South Tower was hit at 9:03, 17 minutes later. It collapsed in 56 minutes. That was United Airlines Flight 175. Same aircraft, 767-200ER. Estimated impact velocity was 566 miles an hour, and it hit on the south face of the South Tower between the 77th and the 85th floor. And you see it did not hit straight on like the North Tower was. It hit at an angle more towards the corner of the building. Notice also that the shape of the central core was different. Here you're hitting on the long side, on this one you're hitting on the short side. Looking at the north tower, it hit between the 95th and the 96th floors, pitched about 10 to 11 degrees down, and the 98th floor is where the collapse actually initiated. There's no argument about that because that's photographic evidence. Up here is where the collapse started. The plane hit down here. If you look at the north face, you see that the wings were rolled up at about 25 to 30 degrees, so the impact zone looked like this. Again, between the 95th and 96th floor mainly, you see the 98th floor had very little damage to it. Here's a discussion of that impact.
The fact that they were designed to resist over 13,000 tons of wind pressure meant that they could not be knocked over. In a remarkably prescient interview given over 15 years ago, Charlie Thornton, now one of the investigators, considered the scenario.
Well, 13,000 tons is a lot of force. People always talk about an airplane crashing into a building. And in 1944 or 45, a plane did crash into the Empire State Building. But the largest aircraft flying today, at least commercially, the 747, fully loaded, is on the order of 300 tons. So if you think about a 300-ton element crashing into a building that's been designed to carry 13,000 tons, you can see that an aircraft crashing into the World Trade Center would probably not do anything to the major building. It could affect localized structural elements, could knock out a column, and there could be some damage. But as far as a plane knocking a building over of that type, that would not happen.
Since the Empire State accident had shown that a plane could crash into a New York skyscraper, the designers were forced to consider the possibility.
In fact, the towers were designed to take a hit from a Boeing 707. John Skilling, the designer, said that his analysis indicated the biggest problem would be the fact that the fuel would dump into the building, but the building structure would still be there. Boeing 707 is very close in size to the Boeing 67s that actually hit the building. The robustness of the perimeter frame tube system and the large size of the building helped the towers withstand the impact. And the structural system redistributed the loads without collapsing in the place of the aircraft impact. That's what NIST admits. Looks something like this. They analyzed the aircraft impact, this is the North Tower again, and said that the wings were shredded before they hit the central core. The diameter of the fuselage is only about 16.5 feet. The central core was 135 feet wide. So there's very little damage to the central core caused by the plane impact. They rendered the views of the impact damage between the 94th and the 97th floor. They see that the impact damage was greatest on the 95th and the 96th floors. It's not much by the time you get up here to 97th, and the 98th floor where collapse initiated, they didn't even show. Looking at a pictorial view of the calculated damage to the central core, we see up here on the 98th floor where the collapse initiated, there's no damage or very little to those columns. Down here is where the most damage occurred to the central core. As to the jet fuel effects, on the 98th floor, you only got about 240 gallons of the total of 10,000 gallons that the planes were carried that were distributed to that load. And the amount of fuel spilled in the simulation only influenced the results in the first few minutes. The long-term behavior of the simulated fires was unaffected. So most of that fuel burned off rapidly, and the remaining fires were caused by the contents of the building. Here's why the aircraft impact and the jet fuel could not have caused collapse. The wings didn't make it to the central core. Most of the jet fuel was aerosolized on impact, Much of it remained outside the building. That which did enter the building burned up within a few minutes. The redundant steel frame redistributed the loads, and the factor of safety against vertical collapse for the perimeter columns was 5-to-1, and for the central core was 3-to-1. This is far too high for the impact damage to approximately 20% of the columns to have caused collapse. Now, the NIST theory is that the perimeter columns failed in the following manner. The fires inside the building heated up the floor trusses, and the floor trusses eventually buckled and sagged and pulled the perimeter columns in, and they buckled, and that's what initiated the collapse of the building. They did a model analysis of a typical floor frame. They heated it up. You can see here, they heated it up. And in the early phases of the heating, the truss expanded. It actually is pushing outward on the perimeter columns with a force here of about 80 kips, which is 80,000 pounds. And it wasn't until it got up here to about 560 degrees when it began to buckle that it then began to sag and reversed the force on the perimeter columns, pulling in on it with a force of about 19 to 14 kips. So that's their analysis of what happened to the floor trusses in the areas where there were fires. However, their global model couldn't produce an inward force from the sagging floor trusses that was strong enough to pull the columns inward. So they supplied an inward bowing force of 5,000 pounds to each truss to column connection at each story in the impact zone. They did that because they said, well, we see that the columns bowed in before the buildings collapsed. We couldn't get the force with the sagging floor trusses, so we'll apply these artificial forces in order to make it work. Very creative. That force of 5,000 pounds to each undamaged truss to column connection is about 750 kips that they applied to that face of the building in order to make it act in the following way. This is the area that deflected inward. It deflected inward according to this measurement, which is taken off of a photograph of a total of about 55 inches. That was at 10:22, which was 7 minutes before the building collapsed. So looking at their explanation carefully, they said that the south wall, again we're talking about the north tower that was hit on the north side, they said the south wall collapsed with continually increased bowing. As more columns buckled, the entire width of the south wall buckled. Instability started at the center of the south wall, rapidly progressed horizontally toward the sides. As a result of the buckling of the south wall significantly unloaded, redistributed its load to the softened core, through the hat truss, and through the east and west walls through the spandrels. 2 minutes before the collapse, the north, east, and west walls at floor 98 carried about 7%, 35%, and 30% more gravity loads than they did right after the impact, and the south wall carried about 7%, and the core 20% less loads. Then the section above the impact zone tilted to the south as the column instability progressed rapidly from the south wall to the east and west walls, resulting in an increased gravity load on the core columns, the release of potential energy due to the downward movement of the building mass above the buckled columns exceeded the strain energy that could be absorbed in the structure, and global collapse ensued. So that's their description of the collapse initiation, okay, how it all started. Started in the south wall, spread to the east and west walls, pulled in the columns, led to global collapse. The problems with their report are these. There's no evidence or basis for the claim that sagging trusses could pull in the south wall of the north tower. In fact, their own model showed that. They couldn't get the loads that they needed, so they applied artificial loads that was necessary to match the photographic evidence. With a factor of safety of 5, the load increased to the east wall, and the load increase to the east and west walls of 35% and 30% respectively would only increase the demand on those columns to about 27% of their capacity. So there's no reason to expect them to fail. They simply assume a horizontal propagation across the building. And then they simply assumed global vertical collapse would ensue And then they relied on a paper by Northwestern University professor Zdeněk Bezant for an explanation of the vertical collapse propagation. The video evidence, however, shows that the core columns are what actually collapsed first. We'll see that here.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
So the NIST collapse initiation theory, which is based upon the exterior columns failing first, is proven wrong by the evidence. Here's 3 photos that are taken a 30th of a second apart. If you look at the antenna on top of the building, you'll see that a 30th of a second later, it's already started to drop and start to drop some more. FEMA said that the core columns failed first. They noted that the transmission tower on top of the north tower began to move downward and lateral slightly before movement was evidenced at the exterior wall. This suggests that the collapse began with one or more failures in the central core area of the building. That's directly from the FEMA report. So the NIST and FEMA reports are contradicting each other. The hat truss that they were talking about sits on the top of the building, and it serves to transfer the vertical and lateral loads between the perimeter columns and the core columns. The core columns supported the hat truss, and the hat truss supported the antenna. So the core columns failed first, and that's shown by the video evidence, and FEMA agreed with that. Core columns fail, the hat truss and the antenna descend before the perimeter columns. Then the core columns pull on the floor trusses, and the floor trusses are what pulls in the perimeter columns, and that's what initiates the complete collapse of the building. This is a video taken of the south tower right before it collapsed, and we can see the perimeter columns being pulled in here. They're buckling inward. So something is pulling those columns in. It must have been caused by the core column failures, because the core columns pull on the floor trusses, and the floor trusses would pull in the perimeter columns, and that would initiate complete collapse. It would look like this. So now we're going to look at the progressive collapse theory that NIST used to explain their collapse of the Twin Towers, and it was submitted to the ASCE Journal of Engineering Mechanics 2 days after the attacks. So this guy came up with this theory within 2 days and submitted it for publication, and the ASCE published it in January of 2002, about 4 months later. He claimed that a large dynamic load would have occurred caused by what he termed a powerful jolt, and that would overcome the reserve strength of the columns below. But various questions were raised about his theory, and he had to defend it again in an article titled "What Did and Did Not Cause the Collapse of World Trade Center Twin Towers in New York," which the Journal of Engineering Mechanics again published in October of 2008. He used an energy analysis to construct his progressive collapse theory, and that's a mathematical model that claims that the kinetic energy of the upper part of the building when it fell on the lower part of the building was greater than the resistance of the buckling columns that failed in the collapse initiation zone, plus the inertial resistance of the structure in the building below the initiation zone, plus the structural resistance of the columns in the building below the initiation zone. So, in mathematics, it looks like this. E1 is greater than E2 plus E3 plus E4, where E1 is the kinetic energy of the falling upper part of the building, E2 is the sum of resistance to buckling of columns in the initiation zone, E3 is the conservation of momentum of the upper story of the lower part being hit by the falling upper part, and E4 is the sum of resistance to collapse of columns in the lower part. He's saying this was greater than the sum of those. Now, Newton's third law of motion says that for every motion, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So when the upper part of the building fell on the lower part of the building, there must have been an equal and opposite force opposing that impact. Measurement of the World Trade Center was made by David Chandler in late 2008, and that showed a continuous acceleration at about 2/3 of gravity with no deceleration, and the deceleration is needed for the load amplification. Remember, Besant said there would be a powerful jolt, but when you measure the velocity versus time, the slope of that line is the acceleration, and it turns out to be about 2/3 of gravity, and there's no jolt. It's continuous. So, according to the evidence, there was never any jolt. McQueen and Zambodi published the missing jolt, a simple refutation of the NIST-Besant collapse hypothesis on a website. And Chandler published his destruction of the World Trade Center North Tower in Fundamental Physics on the same website a year later. So Besant and his co-author again defended their theory, why the observed motion history of the World Trade Centers is smooth. In January of 2011, JEM published that. Zambodi and Johns came back and submitted a discussion paper and said that there were errors in Besant's paper. So, a year later, they were notified by the Journal of Engineering Mechanics that their discussion paper was rejected on the basis of one reviewer's comments. So they immediately responded to that rejection with a rebuttal showing that the rejection was unjustified and the reviewer was wrong on almost all points. So then the JEM editors responded by agreeing to publish their paper. But another year went by and they didn't. So they sent another letter to the JEM in May of 2013 and inquired about the status of their discussion paper, and 3 months later the editors came back and told them that it was out of scope and wouldn't be published. While all this was occurring, Zambodi and Johns joined with another researcher, Zudolinsky, and they wrote a full technical note addressing all 4 of his papers that the JEM had published. It was submitted to the JEM in May of 2012 and was rejected again after a few months as being out of scope with no further explanation. So they then submitted it to the International Journal of Protective Structures, where it was published in June of 2013. So they had no luck publishing any of their questions about his theory with the ASCE journals. Now the problems with his calculations are these. First of all, he used a maximum design load for the mass of the upper part of the building instead of the actual in-service load. He used 54 million kilograms where it was actually about 33 million kilograms. Secondly, he used a velocity after a fall of 1 story at full acceleration of gravity, about 8.5 meters per second, but the actual measurements show it was only about 6.1 meters per second. And since the velocity is squared in the kinetic energy equation, that doubled that contribution. So due to his nearly doubling the mass and the velocity contributions to the kinetic energy, E1 was too high by a factor of almost 4. E2, the fall of the initiation through the initiation zone, did not account for the buckling resistance, which he eliminated completely. So he reduced E2 to 0, said that those columns didn't provide any resistance at all. Then he took the conservation of momentum calculation. He used only 627,000 kilogram mass for the story below. That's only about 14% of what it should be, according to his own figures, which he used for calculating the upper mass of the upper section. So E3 was too low by a factor of about 7. And then the estimate of the resistance of the columns in the lower part of the building was only about 31% of what it can actually shown to be. So E4 was too low by a factor of 3. So we see a pattern here. This was too high by a factor of 4. This was 0. This was too low by a factor of 7. This was too low by a factor of 3. When you correct those miscalculations in his theory, you get a reversal of the inequality. So E1 is less than E2 plus E3 plus E4, and the progressive collapse will not occur. This is why ASCE doesn't want to discuss this matter. When you graph his results, Besant's on the left here in the blue line, the actual measured by Chandler, and what it should have been if the values were corrected, you see that he has no jolt and the acceleration continues. The actual acceleration did continue according to Chandler, but if you put in the correct values, you see that the collapse would have stopped after about 2 seconds. So the building shouldn't have collapsed, according to his theory. In a gravitational collapse, you'd see the top 12 stories of the building driving down the lower part of the building. But here in the photo, you see that it's already disappeared. And the collapse is not even halfway done. According to FEMA, the primary debris field is about 1,200 feet in diameter, and a lot of the material landed outside the tower's footprint. We're going to watch what happens here, and we'll see that half of the 12 stories disintegrate in about 3 seconds before any collapse occurs below. Watch the top of the building versus the top of the lower section. Somehow the upper part of the building is disappearing without the lower part being affected. The collapse is also symmetric for the first several seconds. Notice that the smoke is coming out evenly around the building on all sides. In the south tower, you see the onset of destruction here. Notice that the upper part of the building is already leaning, but the destruction is occurring again symmetrically around the building. Why is that important? Well, remember how the plane hit the building. It hit at an angle, not symmetrically into one side, yet you're getting symmetric collapse. Then there's a question of how fires relate to steel frame high-rises. There's never been a case where a steel frame high-rise collapsed due to fire. There's 3 examples we have here: a 62-story building in Los Angeles, burned for 3.5 hours over 5 floors. Philadelphia in '91, 38-story, burned 18 hours for 8 floors. And October 2004 in Caracas, Venezuela, and you had a 56-story building that burned for 17 hours over 26 floors. None of those buildings collapsed or showed any signs of potential collapse. And in fact, it had never happened that a steel-framed high-rise had collapsed due to fire before September 11th, 2001, or since. Bill Manning was concerned about the destruction of the evidence. He's the editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine. He said structural steel from the World Trade Center has been and continues to be cut up and sold for scrap. Such destruction of evidence shows an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. Very little effort was made to preserve the evidence related to this unprecedented collapse of the skyscrapers 1, 2, and 7. Easily the 3 largest and most perplexing structural failures in history.
When did you become aware that the steel from the World Trade Center was being sold off?
I think it was on the order of a week or so before we arrived on site on October the 5th, I believe it was.
So in other words, the city was selling or was disposing of material within 2 weeks of the actual event?
I believe I was the first one to find out that the steel is being recycled. New York Times reporter Jim Glantz told me 2 weeks after the collapse, and I tried to contact city, and also New York Times reporters tried to make sure we can have access to steel to do the research. It was not happening.
I just think there's so much that has been lost in these last 6 months that we can never go back and retrieve. And it's not only unfortunate, it's borderline criminal.
400 truckloads per day of material were taken away from the World Trade Center site and sent to China for recycling.
There were laws violated in the destruction of that evidence. And for the American Society of Civil Engineers to ignore those events is extremely disturbing and is a violation, in my opinion, of their professional code of ethics.
it was contrary to the way all investigations are done. If an airplane crashes, they seal off the entire area, nobody touches anything, they move it to a secure location, and they reconstruct an aircraft.
Normally, when you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science. It's trying to prove preconceived ideas.
Destruction of the evidence. This is John Gross. He's one of the engineers from NIST. He was in the salvage yards deciding what material to save for further analysis. They only saved between 1/4 and 1/2% of the steel from the Twin Towers and only one small piece from World Trade Center 7, which we saw earlier. Out of the steel they did save, testing showed that only 3 pieces had experienced temperatures above 250 degrees centigrade and none above 600 degrees centigrade. When they were confronted about the lack of high steel temperature evidence, they claimed that there was not a big enough sample for them to draw conclusions. However, they were the ones that were selecting the sample. We looked at this before. The USGS flew over the site. 5 days later, there were high temperatures noted in the surface. And again, no mention of them in any of the reports. So to summarize the problems with the World Trade Center Tower report, their claim that the upper part of the towers crushed the lower part of the towers violates the law of conservation of momentum and the law that for every action between bodies there's an equal and opposite reaction, as shown by the measured, smooth, uninterrupted descent of the upper portion of the North Tower. They claim that the floor trusses pushed outward on the perimeter columns with a force of about 80 kips before starting to sag and pull the columns inward to cause the buildings to collapse, but there's no evidence to support this claim. Extensive photos and videos of the tower show no outward bowing of the perimeter columns at any time during the fires before the collapse, which would have had to occur if they had been subjected to an 80 kip force. They imposed unrealistic artificial 5 kip forces per story on all the perimeter columns with floor truss connections over the complete 5 stories of the damage zone on the south face of the North Tower in order to make them collapse and make their initiation model work. This amounts to a lateral force of about 750 kips applied to that face of the building, which cannot be justified by any rationale. They didn't investigate or explain the global collapse which occurred after the collapse initiation was supposedly initiated by the column failures in the impact zone. They simply state global collapse ensued. Their collapse sequence was initiated by the failure of the floor trusses, according to them, in the impact zone, subsequent pulling into the perimeter columns, but this sequence ignores the fact that the core columns failed first, evidenced by the video of the North Tower collapse showing that the antenna and hat truss resting on the core columns began their descent well before the outer perimeter of the building began to fall. They failed to provide any information suggesting that the load capacity of the core and perimeter columns was exceeded at any time during the collapse sequence. They ignored the fact that the factor of safety of 3 in the core column and 5 in the perimeter columns would have prevented the failure mechanism that they theorize in their collapse initiation model. Their global collapse theory depends upon the ASCE published Progressive Collapse Theory by Zdenek Bazant. His theory has been shown to have erroneous input data, rendering it non-viable as an explanation for the observed behavior of the vertical propagation. They refuse to acknowledge the errors in the input data of his theory. If we categorize them, the errors, into specific categories, we get the defective collapse initiation theories in both buildings, Twin Towers and the World Trade Center 7. They make unjustified assumptions and errors in both reports. There are omissions and alterations of the construction details in the World Trade Center 7 report. There are errors in the calculations of their ASCE published theories. There are internal contradictions in the World Trade Center 7 report. They ignored the evidence of high temperature exposure of the structural steel in World Trade Center 7. And both NIST and ASCE refused to respond to peer criticism. So in closing, I'd like to point out that the information that we've collected and presented here brings us to the conclusion that the NIST reports on the destruction of the 3 buildings, along with ASCE progressive collapse theory that purports to explain the collapse of the Twin Towers, cannot survive rational scrutiny, and therefore a new investigation is required. Stepping back for a moment, it's useful to remember that Archimedes, considered by many to be the world's first professional engineer, once famously said, "Give me a place to stand and I will move the world." He was using the figure of speech to illustrate the principle of leverage. It is an ironic twist of fate that today we engineers find that the destruction of these 3 buildings gives our profession the opportunity, indeed the obligation, to take a stand for a new investigation of these events, and in so doing, create the chance to move the world to a better place. So here's what we can do. As engineers, anyone can sign the Architects and Engineers for Truth petition for a new investigation, disseminate the information to our engineering colleagues, donate to AE 9/11 Truth to help us reach as many engineers as possible with this information, urge any engineering organization to which you belong to call for a new investigation, and become a volunteer presenter for Project Due Diligence to help deliver this information to local engineering organizations. What would that new investigation that we want look like? We would recommend that we be allowed to participate as an organization, since we've been leading the call for a forensic investigation all this time. That it be composed of a panel of civil, structural, fire protection, mechanical engineers, physicists, chemists, and demolition experts. That the panel members be vetted so that they have no conflict of interests. That it be provided with a staff to prepare documents and keep records. That it have subpoena power. That it have adequate funding. A reasonable timeline to conduct the investigation and prepare a peer-reviewed report, and that report to be released and broadly disseminated to the public. At the end of this presentation, we have a reference for every slide that you've seen. These reports, some of them are videos, some of them are hyperlinks, some of them are PDF files. Every slide that you've seen is referenced so that you can fact check us, make sure that the information that we've given you is accurate, that it's complete and correct. This will be available on our website. Anybody can get to it. Any problems with it? We're open to any criticisms, comments, and I'd like to open up the floor now for anyone who'd like to speak.